What happens when a war has no clear objective, no clear end, and no clear path forward? In a rare and striking moment, a former US Secretary of Defense, someone who led troops across decades of conflict, has publicly warned that the current war strategy is fundamentally flawed. His message is blunt. Airstrikes alone have never toppled a regime in modern history. Yet the war continues to escalate, with new ideas emerging that could put American troops directly on the ground. So the question is no longer just about winning, but whether anyone actually knows what winning even looks like. A major debate is unfolding in Washington over the direction of the ongoing conflict involving the United States and Iran. At the center of this debate is a stark assessment from a former US Secretary of Defense, who spent decades in military service and played key roles in multiple wars. In a detailed public discussion, he criticized how the conflict has been handled from the start. According to his analysis, the original objectives, such as forcing unconditional surrender or achieving regime change, were unrealistic from the beginning. He emphasized that history has consistently shown that air power alone cannot remove a government from power. While bombing campaigns can damage infrastructure and weaken military capabilities, they rarely dismantle the underlying political structure that keeps a regime intact. Despite thousands of reported strikes against Iranian targets, there is still no clear resolution. Iran continues to demonstrate operational capability, including the use of long-range missiles. In one recent example, Iran launched intermediate-range ballistic missiles toward a US base over 2,000 miles away. Although the attack did not successfully hit its target, it revealed the potential reach of Iran's military, raising concerns that similar weapons could threaten regions far beyond the Middle East. Meanwhile, the US administration is reportedly considering new options, including deploying ground forces. One idea under discussion involves sending troops to seize a strategically significant island associated with Iran's oil infrastructure. The goal would be to use it as leverage in negotiations, particularly regarding access to a critical global shipping route. However, lawmakers and military veterans have raised serious concerns about this approach. Some warn that sending troops into such an environment without a clear strategy could result in heavy casualties. They argue that the situation risks repeating past conflicts where initial military success did not translate into long-term stability. At the same time, questions remain about the accuracy of intelligence assessments guiding the war. Reports suggest that some key threat evaluations may not have originated from the broader intelligence community, but rather from within political leadership itself. As the conflict continues, the gap between tactical military actions and broader strategic goals appears to be widening. To understand how the situation reached this point, it is important to look at both historical patterns and the unique structure of Iran's political and military system. Modern warfare has repeatedly demonstrated a key principle. Destroying military assets does not automatically collapse a government. This was evident in conflicts such as Iraq and Afghanistan, where initial military victories were followed by prolonged instability. Even when leadership figures were removed, underlying networks often remained intact and capable of reorganizing. Iran presents an even more complex case. Unlike centralized regimes that rely heavily on a single chain of command, Iran's power structure is distributed across multiple layers. Key institutions, including elite military units and local networks, operate in a decentralized manner. This means that even if high-level leadership is disrupted, the broader system can continue functioning. In addition, Iran has spent decades preparing for asymmetric warfare. Rather than relying solely on conventional military strength, it has developed strategies designed to counter more technologically advanced opponents. These include underground facilities, mobile missile systems, drone capabilities, and defensive networks embedded within civilian areas. One of the most critical elements in this conflict is control over a major maritime choke point, through which a significant portion of the world's oil supply passes. When Iran restricted access to this route, it demonstrated its ability to influence global energy markets. This move effectively turned a regional conflict into an issue with worldwide economic implications. Another key factor is the nuclear question. While previous military actions were described as having severely damaged Iran's nuclear program, evidence suggests that critical components may still exist. This raises concerns about how quickly Iran could rebuild its capabilities, and whether military action alone can prevent that outcome. Historically, conflicts driven by unclear objectives tend to expand rather than resolve. Without a defined end goal, military operations can continue indefinitely, creating what analysts often describe as a forever war. This risk is particularly high when both sides retain the ability to escalate. In this case, the absence of a clear strategy, combined with evolving military developments, has created a situation where each new move increases uncertainty rather than reducing it. At its core, this situation highlights a fundamental disconnect between tactical success and strategic clarity. On the surface, the numbers suggest significant military progress. Thousands of targets have been struck, key facilities have been damaged, portions of Iran's military infrastructure have been degraded. From a purely operational standpoint, these are measurable achievements. However, war is not defined by the number of targets destroyed, it is defined by outcomes. And this is where the current strategy faces its greatest challenge. The central question is not how much damage has been inflicted, but whether that damage has changed the behavior of the opposing side in a meaningful and lasting way. So far, the answer appears to be no. Iran continues to operate, continues to respond, and continues to demonstrate capabilities that were expected to be diminished. The ability to launch long-range missiles even unsuccessfully signals that its deterrence capacity is still intact. More importantly, Iran's decision to restrict a key global shipping route shows that it retains strategic leverage. In fact, that leverage may be stronger now than it was before the conflict escalated. By demonstrating its willingness to disrupt global trade, Iran has introduced economic pressure into the equation, something that military strikes alone cannot easily counter. This creates a paradox. The more the conflict continues, the more leverage Iran may gain in certain areas. Another critical issue is the lack of a clearly defined end state. Early objectives such as regime change or unconditional surrender have largely faded from official discussion. This suggests a shift in expectations, but without a corresponding shift in strategy. When goals are scaled back without being clearly redefined, it becomes difficult to measure success. This ambiguity can lead to prolonged engagement without a clear exit. The discussion around deploying ground forces further illustrates this problem. Sending troops into a highly fortified and prepared environment is not just a tactical decision, it is a strategic commitment. It signals a willingness to escalate the conflict to a new level. However, without a clear plan for what comes after such an operation, the risks increase significantly. History provides multiple examples of this dynamic. Initial deployments intended as limited actions often evolve into long-term engagements. Once forces are on the ground, withdrawal becomes more complicated both politically and militarily. There is also the issue of cost. Financially, the conflict is already demanding significant resources. Additional funding requests suggest that the scale of operations could expand even further. At the same time, the potential human cost, particularly if ground forces are deployed, remains a major concern. Another layer of complexity comes from the role of intelligence. Accurate intelligence is the foundation of effective strategy. If threat assessments are influenced by political considerations rather than independent analysis, the risk of miscalculation increases. In this case, questions about how certain conclusions were reached have added to the uncertainty surrounding the decision-making process. Ultimately, the situation reflects a broader strategic dilemma. Military force can achieve specific objectives, but it cannot, by itself, resolve underlying political conflicts. Without a parallel diplomatic strategy, even the most successful military operations may fail to produce lasting results. This is why many analysts argue that negotiation is not just an option, it is a necessity. However, negotiations require leverage on both sides, and as the conflict continues, that balance of leverage is constantly shifting. Looking ahead, several potential paths could emerge from the current situation. The first scenario is continued escalation. If both sides maintain their current positions, the conflict could intensify. Additional strikes, expanded military operations, and potential deployment of ground forces would increase the scale of the war. This path carries the highest risk, including broader regional involvement and greater economic disruption. The second scenario is limited tactical engagement combined with indirect negotiation. In this case, military actions would continue, but with the goal of strengthening bargaining positions rather than achieving decisive victory. Behind the scenes, diplomatic channels could open, leading to a negotiated arrangement. This approach has been used in past conflicts where neither side could achieve a clear win. The third scenario is a shift toward direct negotiation. This would require both sides to acknowledge that a military solution is unlikely. Talks could focus on specific issues such as maritime access, sanctions, and nuclear oversight. While difficult, this path offers the most stable long-term outcome. The fourth scenario is strategic stalemate. In this outcome, neither side escalates significantly, but neither side backs down. The conflict remains unresolved, with periodic flare-ups and ongoing tension. This is often the result when costs of escalation are high, but incentives for compromise are low. Each of these scenarios depends on decisions that have yet to be made, and each carries its own risks and consequences. What we are witnessing is not just a military conflict, but a test of strategy, leadership, and long-term vision. The warnings from experienced military leaders highlight a crucial point. Success in war is not measured by destruction alone. It is measured by outcomes that align with clearly defined objectives. Right now, those objectives remain unclear. The gap between tactical actions and strategic goals continues to widen, and as that gap grows, so does the risk of unintended consequences, both on the battlefield and beyond. The idea of sending ground troops, the ongoing missile exchanges, and the economic impact of disrupted trade routes all point to a conflict that is becoming more complex, not less. At some point, every war reaches a moment where decisions must shift from force to resolution. The question is whether that moment will come through escalation or through negotiation. And perhaps the most important question of all, if no one can clearly define what victory looks like, how will anyone recognize it when it arrives?